On Zareth 9 the rain did not fall so much as corrode, combing the scrap mountains into metallic dunes and turning the gullies into rivers the color of old coins. Vorn Kalin moved through that weather the way a man crosses a bad memory. Head down, steps sure, hands busy because busy was cheaper than regret. His scanner popped and hissed in his ear, a counterpoint to the distant groan of collapsing hulls, and he let its dots lead him toward a plateau of dead engines, where rumor said a pre-war thrust bell might still be sleeping. The junk moon was a world built out of endings, and Vorn made his living arguing with them. Stubbornness had kept his lungs in his chest when other salvagers had traded theirs for filters, and stubbornness had kept his workshop sign half-lit even when the power grid's patience wore thin. He had a map in his head no cartographer would pay for. A web of paths between ship carcasses and broken cranes and vats that hissed like animals, and somewhere under that map lived the only oath he had ever kept. If a thing still tried to work, he would not leave it to rust. The sound that turned him left was not metal. It was small and human in shape, even if it did not come from a human throat, a wet gasp catching at the edge of silence and then failing to fall back into it. He killed the scanner, cut his lamp to half, and shouldered his way between a torqued bulkhead and the ribcage of a freighter, following breath instead of profit. The pile that hid her was an argument between gravity and carelessness. Wing panels layered over crate metal, and then swallowed by rain. Vorn wedged his shoulder into the seam and pried until the world shifted an inch, then another, and then the whole tilt of things gave up and slid. She lay there as if the junkyard had tried to bury her nicely. Limbs tucked, head turned, a halo of wiring snarled around translucent wrists where cable ties had become bracelets after the ties wore away. The word burned into her forearm, raised the skin in a scar you could follow with a fingertip. Defective. Vorn did not say anything profound because nobody honest rehearses for this. He dropped to a knee and did the work at hand. Her skin was the pale blue of coolant, threaded with veins that pulsed a slow, stubborn rhythm. Her fingers were wrong in a way that said somebody had changed their mind halfway through. Her eyes were wide and gold and as wary as anything born in a lab that pretended to be a nursery. He saw the signature ports at the base of her skull where updates go in and orders come out, saw the lab's stamp at her clavicle where a sequence of digits tried to replace a lineage. He slid his thermal coat under her shoulders, felt the shiver of muscles built for obedience and nothing else, and said the only sentence that didn't seem like a lie in his mouth. "You're not trash." The rain pouted at them from the lip of the rearranged scrap, impatient with any kindness that delayed its erosion. Vorn ignored it, palmed a can of sealant to the punctures that could not be bandaged, and popped a chem-worm under the coat, where a heart would be, whether a committee liked it or not. He carried her as you carry a thing the world has misnamed, careful but unafraid, down the path thieves use when they don't want to be seen, and set her on the pallet under his storm shelter, where the roof was a pair of old cargo doors he had taught to hinge. The shelter shuddered in a gust and held, as if the bolts had decided to take his side for once. He cleaned what he could clean, not with the reverence of a surgeon, but with the tidy, irritated competence of a man who has rebuilt more engines than friendships. Alcohol wipe, micromesh, a strip of flex wrapped around a cracked digit to keep it honest. She watched him from the corner of her eyes the way feral animals watch hands. She knew hands did harm. She had not yet seen them do anything else. He kept his voice low and unambitious while he worked, offering the ordinary nouns that break panic into pieces a breath can manage: cloth, heat, water, name. She did not take the last one. She listened. That was the first thing he let himself count as a win. The junkyard doesn't forgive long pauses. Opportunists read them as invitations. A loader rattled by beyond the fence with a crew of boys who hadn't yet learned what mercy costs and were therefore rich in theories. Vorn let them pass, let the yard settle back onto its haunches, and only then turned his attention to the brand again. Defective was not a diagnosis. It was a verdict disguised as a word. He could not erase it with anything at hand, but he could cover it, so he cut the sleeve from one of his shirts and made her a band that belonged to neither lab nor market. The rain turned from sheet to pins and then eased altogether, as if the sky had decided to save some malice for later. He dragged a drum heater closer, flicked the striker until flame admitted its usefulness, and sat on a crate with his back to the storm door, like a hinge with opinions, counting her breaths until they found a pace that sounded like choice. He slept in a chair because he did not know which angle of the room she would forgive. And when the Junkyard's morning came in on tiptoe, the light yellow and sickly, the air tasting of ozone and pennies, he woke to find his coat pulled more snugly around her shoulders and his toolbox nudged half a meter closer to his chair. He pretended not to notice either kindness. Pride does not like being caught at first breath. He boiled water, brewed something that called itself broth, and laid out his a set of tools small enough to look like toys, micro-drivers, half a suture kit, the good tweezers with the sullen spring. Somewhere outside, a trio of drones negotiated whose turn it was to alert the wrong authorities. A clicking chorus of broken devices started up, the way the yard always greeted daylight. Vorn lifted a spoon to her lips and discovered that she had been waiting to be asked. "We're going to fix what can be fixed," he said, because the oath he knew fit most kinds of machines, even the ones with gold eyes, and we're going to ignore anything that disagrees. Trust did not arrive with a fanfare. It arrived by millimeters, gained and lost, and gained again in the quiet transactions of morning. He showed her the needle before he set it, let her see the seal still intact, and told her why the pain would be worth its cost. She flinched, nodded once in a movement so small it might have been an involuntary twitch, and held still long enough to let him slip warm saline into a vein that had been taught not to want anything. When the tremors hit, he pressed his palm against the flex mesh at her ribs and counted with her through the worst of it. Slow, patient numbers that any child might resent and any adult might envy. In the space between shocks, he pried grit from the splits along her knuckles and sealed them with glue meant for ducts, not skin, because that is what he had and she needed something. A person is a system, he thought, and a system can be stabilized with the right parts. The uncomfortable addendum, that this system had been designed for obedience and then discarded when it surprised its owners, he set aside for later, because later was when he usually let himself be angry. Speech came back to her like a hesitant instrument, a string tightened a fraction with each breath, a note testing its own existence. The first sound she made had no word inside it. The second had the bones of one. The third broke so cleanly on the syllable that Vorn felt paper cuts along the architecture of his calm. He pulled a stool up beside the pallet and showed her the outside world on his cracked handheld. The map of the yard, the icons he used to name his stashes, the thumbnail he had tagged for the shack where he kept the small generator that hated him. He tapped each symbol and said the word it stood for, offering the way children are offered the names of hand-me-down toys. She pointed at the little blue dot that was the shelter itself and opened her mouth. And what came out was not a perfect pronunciation of shelter, but something that meant safe in a language that wasn't his, and felt like it should be. "Close," he said, which was an engineer's compliment when the math didn't lie, but the units disagreed. He did not ask her where the lab was, because a map to a wound is not the same as a route to healing, and because he had learned that the first questions you ask in a place like this should be the smallest ones possible. "Do you want more heat? Is this too tight? Can I touch your hand?" When he tried the last, she startled like a creature who had only ever known those words as warnings. He drew back, let the silence decide, and then, when her fingers crept forward, put his palm under hers without closing his grip. Her hand was quick and cool and too careful. She held him for a count of 5, and then withdrew as if reminding herself that letting go was still a choice she was allowed to make. He turned to the workbench, because sometimes looking away was the kindest thing a man could offer. And that was when he saw what he had been missing in the shape of her ruined gait. A lab had built her legs for speed and course correction, not for ice or stairs or the petty angles of civilian life. The joints would hold under sprint but not under stutter. In the corner under a tarp he kept a pair of droid limbs salvaged from an agricultural bot. a machine designed to walk furrows all day and not complain about the weather, which meant their patience would be useful. Vorn stripped them down to their tolerances and then below, harvesting the parts that had learned to be humble. Flexor bands tough enough to shrug off sand, a rolling joint with a grease port instead of a proprietary covenant, a heel pad that accepted exactly the right kind of weight. He laid those parts out the way some people lay out prayer beads. Then, sitting on the floor because authority should be smaller than the person it asks to trust, he showed her each piece and built the first brace where she could see every decision. She watched with a focus that could have cut metal. When his screwdriver slipped, she winced in sympathy, not fear. When he tested a hinge, she nodded at the clean motion, as if approving a subordinate's performance review. He strapped the brace around her left calf, the leather still stiff enough to complain. The buckle kissed the brand on her forearm as he tugged it to height, and he found himself wanting to apologize for the way the world keeps letting the wrong nouns touch. "It will feel like the wrong weight for an hour," he said, and then reached into the only vocabulary that had ever worked for him when explaining a new tool. "But the weight is how you'll know where you are." He made a matching rig for the right, and then waited while she tested ownership of her own legs, paying attention not to how far she could go, but to whether she let herself stop when the ask was too big. Naming came to him not as inspiration, but as arithmetic. Zareth 9 had a night wind called Sel that swept the rust dust off the eastern flats, leaving the skeletons of ships visible until the rain dressed them again. In an old Terran tongue, one Vorn's grandmother had insisted on reading to him in bed when the lights cut out. Sel had grown into a word for light that didn't belong to fire. He asked for permission with his eyes, because names given without a request are another kind of brand, and when she tilted her head, as if to ask what a permission would even look like here, he said it aloud. "Silix." The syllables tested the room and didn't find a reason to leave. She repeated it with a careful mouth and a small nod, and the way the corners of her eyes softened when she held the sound told him that a name can be a tool when it is built to fit the hand that holds it. They walked the length of the shelter twice. The first circuit took an age and 3 eternities, each step a debate between past orders and present muscles, between the carved word on her forearm and the heat along her spine. The second took less time because her ankles decided to believe him, not because the braces were perfect, but because the person inside them had begun to demand more. She leaned once on his shoulder, and then pulled away sharply as if the gesture had cost her something she hadn't budgeted for. He pretended to stumble and catch himself on the doorframe, spreading the embarrassment between them until neither had to carry all of it. Outside, the storm relented into a sulk, and then into a wet quiet. Somewhere on the far side of the yard, a loudspeaker coughed alive and muttered bounty prices for serial numbers that made Vorn's jaw ache. It would not have taken much code to add a defective class and call it civic duty. He followed her gaze to the noise and turned the volume down on the speaker with the same small wrench he'd used to give her legs a vote. "There are buyers for shame," he said, "but they pay late." He knew the rumor mill that linked labs to junkyards, the chutes where salvage became a euphemism for burial, and the low men who made a living turning off their better instincts at the gate. He also knew how fast word ran when a human salvager was seen carrying a clone out of the rain. The first knock would not come today. Professional cruelty sleeps in, but the knock would come. He returned to his bench, laid out the parts for a second brace in case she taught the first to grow jealous, and let his voice find a register that had steadied more than one frightened engine and one frightened kid. "You can stay," he said, plain as a floor, "or we can go. Either way, I'm going to teach the word defective to mean nothing in a place that can hear it." She touched the bandage that covered her brand, then slipped her fingers under it and traced the raised letters she couldn't yet admit weren't her name. When she lifted her hand, the cloth stayed put. She looked at him as if calculating a price, and then, astonishingly, as if she had decided she didn't have to. "Silix," she said again, the syllables choosing a shape in her mouth that sounded like a threshold. He answered simply, "Vorn," to keep the math fair. The rain resumed its half-hearted argument with the roof and lost. The heater hummed itself into the kind of work hum that promises to continue, and for the space of a handful of heartbeats, the junk moon felt like any other planet with a kitchen and a door. Only after the warmth found their bones did the yard return to itself, flooding the shelter with a brief, sour flicker as a drone skimmed the fence line and peered in. Vorn did not reach for the gun yet. The first defense, he knew, is the shape of a room that says somebody belongs here. Night came down as a negotiation rather than a curtain, the junkyard trying to decide whether to hide Vorn Kalin or feature him. He worked by the kind of light scavengers trust, a lamp with a temper and a sky that had quit early, winding copper around a cracked insulator, checking the tension on a tripline that only existed for people who meant harm. Silix moved with a new arithmetic, the braces turning each step into a statement rather than an apology. She practiced standing, sitting, pivoting, breaking the old posture that begged and the old silence that paid for it. When the first reconnaissance drone nosed over the fence like a nosy god, Vorn didn't shoot it. He let it see a neat row of scrap, a man in a coat, a girl standing upright with a wrench, and a yard that looked exactly like the last place anyone would leave anything that mattered. The drone's lens blinked the way certainty blinks when it meets doubt, and the rest of the night stood very still to listen. They arrived at the hour when milk would curdle if you looked at it wrong. 4 men and a woman in coats the color of legal trouble. Their boots confident, their breath quiet, their paperwork unnecessary. They did not shout because shouting is for amateurs and mobs. They let their presence speak in the language of sanctioned theft. One of them raised a hand, and the junkyard answered because Vorn had wired it to. A string of bulbs unrolled a path that led nowhere helpful. The loader's horn coughed. A tower of crates shifted its weight like a bored giant. Silix's pupils thinned to coins. Vorn saw the muscles in her jaw count to a number he didn't know and then reset. Property Echo X9. The woman called mildly, as if reading a menu. Decommission phase. Remand to owner. The word owner hung over the yard like a smell. Vorn didn't say no. He made the yard say it for him. The first bounty hunter stepped on a sheet of corrugated hull that Vorn had greased with a mixture of oil and contempt. His weight went out from under him, his pride followed, and the crash persuaded his friends that the ground had opinions. The second reached for a weapon shaped like an apology. Vorn hit a switch, and a curtain of chain fell between them, like a stage deciding to take a bow. Silix stayed exactly where she was, hands visible, blade nowhere to be seen, the braces lengthening her stance into something that had learned to hold space without permission. "You don't want to do this," Vorn said, but not to the hunters. He said it to the night, to the habit of violence, to the part of himself that admired efficiency more than mercy. The woman in charge gestured, and from above came the clean whisper of a kill phrase, the kind of signal laboratories invent when they get bored of ethics. Silix stiffened, breath stopping on a cliff edge. No human language can forgive. Vorn had expected it. He'd soldered a coil the size of a coin into the collar he'd disguised as padding on her brace, a jammer tuned to the frequency of obedience. He thumbed the switch and the signal came apart like a speech that discovers mid-sentence it has a conscience. Silix inhaled in a rush that sounded like a life refusing to sink. "I'm not yours," she said, not loud, not defiant, just true, the kind of true that unthreads a net. That was the moment the fight actually started. Vorn yanked the pin on a flare that wasn't a flare at all but a bouquet of sparks and magnetized shavings. It soaked the yard in a glittering fog that made targeting computers question their childhoods. Silix moved with a new economy. No flourish, no permission. Stepping in and out of the fog like someone rewriting a diagram in real time. A drone dropped to flank. She caught it by the intake, twisted, and put it into the ground with the finality of a shape, finding its intended hole. The man who had fallen first stood groggily, learned nothing, and rushed. Vorn intercepted him with a shock wrench tuned to hum rather than crack, pain rather than damage, a lesson rather than a sentence. The woman in charge stayed back, calculating, and the calculation made Vorn's teeth itch. A shot snapped from the shadows by the freighter ribs, the sound flat and hungry. Vorn felt the bullet's idea of him pass close, and made the loader lunge with a kick that had taken him a week to calibrate. The machine jumped forward like a dog that had finally been given clear instructions, its arms smashing into the stack the shooter thought was his friend. Metal fell. The shooter chose humility and rolled. Celix arrived first. She didn't break him. She put him in a quiet, efficient sleep that would last long enough for him to wake with a different angle on the world. Echo X9, the woman called again, and this time the words had more edges. You are an asset gone awry. Celix looked at Vorn as if she had run out of room for disgust and needed a place to set it down. Celix, he said quickly, before the old name could glue itself back to her skin. That's the only name the air answers to here. The woman raised a palm and an emitter glowed, a device that would not stun, would not kill, would simply erase, from circulation, from paperwork, from the kind of memory institutions keep on bad days. Vorn saw the arc pattern in the emitter's cage and did the ugly math. He threw himself at the chain curtain, ripped a length free, and made the world briefly believe in whips again. The chain sang, and the emitter spun out of a hand that had not expected work. Celix closed the distance that remained. She didn't kick, she didn't punch. She stepped into the space where a person ends and a weapon begins, and pushed the woman backward with both hands. A shove that carried every refusal she had practiced all day, every breath that had chosen to continue. The woman went down, surprised not by force but by the audacity of being treated like a body instead of a job. Sirens arrived late, because systems love to admire their own friction. Patrol lights sprayed authority over the wreckage of men and machines. The yard flickered back to its usual disrepute, as if innocence were a costume it could fold and put away before guests saw it. Vorn stood with his hands away from his tools and his breath steady, the position that says I am dangerous only when you insist. Celix stood beside him, shoulders square, the bandage over her brand dark with rain and effort. Officers took it all in. The traps, the bodies sleeping ugly, the woman in the coat who forgot for a second how to stand like a salary and did what bureaucrats do at the edge of something that does not fit. They stalled. Identification, one said. And Vorn produced a chip with the dignity of a citation. The officer scanned, frowned, scanned again, and found a name that did not yet exist because Vorn had written it 10 minutes ago, while the fog was printing its own universe. Celix Kalen, the chip declared, not as a legal conclusion, but as a mechanical fact. Species listed as recognized person, status, free. The patrolman looked up with the eyes of a man who recognizes a machine that has been serviced better than the manual advised. Paperwork is unusual, he said, which is what people say when they want to admit that harm has been interrupted but lack the authority to praise it. Behind him, the woman in the coat rediscovered anger and tried it on. It fit badly. This is theft, she hissed, and Vorn felt the word roll off him the way rain rolls off a roof that has finally been mended. Correction, he said. This is repair. He did not add that there are objects and there are people, and that only one of those categories can decide to hold your hand back. The patrols escorted the bounty crew out, not because they had chosen a side, but because the forms were easier that way, and the yard exhaled a breath it didn't know it had been holding. After, when the heater had remembered its duty and the lamps had made a halo out of oil and fatigue, Vorn set a tin cup in Celix's hands and looked everywhere except at the bandage. The night had put marks on him. He admired them like any honest tradesman admires the cost of a job well done. Celix watched the steam rise and disappear as if practicing impermanence. When she finally spoke, the words were small and exact, like screws taken from a delicate machine. If I stay, she said, does the world shrink? He shook his head because a good answer should be quick when it can be. If you stay, it grows in our direction, he said. If you go, I go. Then, before doubt could reclothe itself, he let the future purchase the present. And if you'll have me, I'd like the paperwork to be true. Celix did not smile. She reached across the space that had been engineered to keep her small, took his grease-dark fingers in hers, and squeezed once like a calibration. The yard, which had seen a lot, pretended not to notice. They set the date for when the rain would be light and the wind disinterested, because both of them had learned that it is sensible to ask the weather for its consent. Vorn cleaned the shelter as if it were a chapel, which for him meant sorting bolts by thread, aligning tools by function rather than height, and sweeping the floor until it remembered it was more than a suggestion. He wired lanterns from old satellite housings and slipped nebula glass into the cracked lenses, so the light would arrive with a slow, forgiving color. Celix chose what to wear in the way people choose a job they intend to be good at. She laid out the pieces of armor Vorn had refit for sense rather than ceremony, selected a scarf the exact hue of a clear weld, and wrapped her forearm, not to hide the brand, but to treat it like a scar the room had already forgiven. The Junkyard, offended by elegance, tried to shed a tower of pipe at dawn. Vorn braced it, cursed it, and dusted off his jacket with a dignity that said he would not let gravity upstage him. There was no priest because neither of them required a witness licensed by anyone who would have consigned Celix to parts, and there was no crowd because this was not a spectacle they were willing to rent to rumor. There were, however, neighbors. 3 scavers who knew when to keep their mouths shut and open their hands. The old woman who ran the parts counter and pretended she had always expected this. A boy who had decided Vorn was what adulthood should look like, and therefore insisted on holding a lantern too big for him. They stood in a semicircle that refused to be an audience, more like a wall built to keep out weather. Vorn had etched a sentence into the flank of a retired war engine with the care of a man who only writes when writing is parts work. You are not a mistake. Celix traced the words with her non-bandaged hand as if making sure the metal could carry their weight, then turned to him and did not tremble. Vorn had thought about vows like a mechanic thinks about tolerances. How tight can truths fit without seizing? He said as little as he dared. He promised to keep her machines honest and her fear small, to choose decency over speed, to treat silence as a tool when words would only scratch. He promised to be angry on time and to cool down slower than the heater if a day ever tried to persuade them to be cruel. Celix listened like a student at the end of a lesson that refused to condescend and then answered without looking at the gathered, because eye contact becomes theater at a moment like this. She promised to argue for the solution that broke the least, to let old commands die when better ones arrived, to keep her blade on the wall when a child was in the room, and to speak first when the world tried to rename her. Her voice did not crack. The wind tried and failed to misbehave. Rings felt wrong, too circular, too much like labs and locks, so they exchanged tools. Vorn gave her a driver whose handle he had carved out of ship teak, balanced for her grip. Celix gave him a small panel of polished alloy with the word Defective hand-scratched away and burnished smooth. He slid the driver into the loop at her waist. She slid the panel into the pocket over his heart. Somewhere beyond the fence, a patrol drone peered in, recognized an event outside its jurisdiction, and very sensibly recorded nothing. Overhead, a tramp freighter cut across the gray like a thought a committee had failed to suppress. For a moment, the Junkyard wore its shadow as if trying on a better suit. Vorn laughed because sometimes joy is imprecise and should be allowed to be, and Celix's mouth learned the version of a smile that lives in the eyes. They ate the expensive food. Real bread, a stew with actual plant in it, fruit that insisted on being ripe, and then did the only thing either of them considered truly ceremonial. They worked. Vorn showed a scaver how to route a cable so it wouldn't chafe and break in 6 months. Celix taught the boy with the lantern how to stand so nobody could push him down without making a plan. They replaced a bearing together on a loader that had served as best man and hadn't known it. The machine rumbling its approval when the new part seated with the intimate thunk that says a future is possible. The old woman from the parts counter cried the way people cry when they finally let their cynicism go off shift. The scavers nodded like men who had sketched themselves at weddings they couldn't afford and were surprised to want one anyway. The boy announced that he was a witness, and therefore this counted. Vorn solemnly agreed because the law of a place is whatever good people say it is and then enforce. There was, inevitably, a test, because the world does not respect people enough to let a day be perfect. A thin ship with thin men set down on the ridge, drawn by the rumor that Zareth 9 had yielded an asset whose serial number fetched a bounty, and that the asset had been so incautious as to marry. They came with courtesy and leashes, the kind of men who believe politeness can hide appetite. Silix met them at the fence, driver at her hip, hands easy, posture easier. Vorn stood 5 steps back, which is where you stand when you believe in the person in front of you more than you believe in your own temper. The thin men made their proposition. It was beautiful at a distance and rotten when you held it. Silix did not lift her chin. She repeated her name, which is a kind of shield. She rested a hand over the panel Vorn carried, which is a kind of proof. Then she told them, carefully, that anyone who still used the old word was either careless or for sale, and that either way they should leave hungry. They did, not out of fear, but because men like that don't know what to do when their script is edited. The ship rose, insulted by gravity, and was erased by rain. The boy with the lantern asked if that counted as a fight. Vorn said no. Victories that don't break anything are not fights. They're maintenance. Silix slipped her fingers into Vorn's and looked down at the bandage on her forearm. She did not remove it. She did not need to. The brand was history, and history can be heavy without being in charge. Evening softened the yard until it looked almost domestic. The lanterns burned low. The heater tried to purr. The sentence on the war engine gathered dew and did not mind. Vorn and Silix sat on the pallet that had been a hospital and was now a bench that fit 2, their knees touching, their hands remembering a vow that had decided it would prefer to be muscle memory. They talked about small things, because big things had already agreed to behave. Which shelf would hold the extra hoses? Where to hang the blade so it could be seen and respected? How many chairs a table requires before it counts as hospitality? When the last neighbor left, the old woman patted Silix's shoulder the way a captain pats a bulkhead before a storm, and told Vorn to stop pretending he didn't like festivities. The junkyard, which still had opinions, rattled its fences in a gust, and then, perhaps in a rare fit of blessing, grew quiet. They slept in the shelter with the storm door open, because they trusted the night to come in only as far as they allowed. At some dark hour, the patrol drone returned and hovered over the lanterns to admire its reflection. Vorn dreamed of retrofit kits arriving on time. Silix dreamed of walking without counting. When morning found them, the rain had decided to be gentle, and a message from a nearby settlement blinked on the cracked handheld. A request for help repairing a pump and a line at the end that said, "Bring the one who knows how to make names stick." Vorn kissed Silix's temple where the skin was warm and unmarked, and she laughed, not like a soldier or a refugee, but like a person whose body knew the sound. Then they stood, stretched, and stepped into another day that would try to name them, and would fail. Because they had already done it themselves. The pump at Ridgeway Settlement had been sulking for years, cavitating like a drunk argument and spitting silt into mouths that deserved better. Vorn tore it down with the calm of a man who hears apologies in gaskets and replaces them anyway. Silix stood by the trough with 3 children clinging to her scarf, showing them how to stack stones so a wall resists both wind and boredom. Her braces creaking less with every deliberate step. When the pump finally found its key and shuddered into a steady thrum, the whole square exhaled. Tin roofs relaxed, kettles boiled, and an old foreman with oil under his nails pretended he didn't wipe his eyes. Vorn looked up to see Silix laughing at a joke a child didn't finish, the sound landing lightly on a moon that had taught them all the cost of weight, and realized he had begun to time his days by where her smile chose to stand. News of the repair ran faster than bill collectors, and by dusk, the first runaways limped in. 2 scrap-born synthetics with shoulders like closets, a medic who jumped contract, a clone whose cereal had been drilled into his teeth, and who kept touching his mouth as if trying to edit himself. "Stay," Silix told them, and Vorn nodded because staying is easier when the invitation is given in plural. They turned the junkyard into a diagram of welcome. Vorn strung line voltage between lampposts in loops that looked careless and weren't, buried coils under the paths to teach intruders manners, and welded a door that swung easy for people and heavy for policy. Silix rewrote her own firmware in the evenings with a stylus and a stubborn lower lip, stripping out all the quiet, poisonous assertions that had been threaded into the spaces between her thoughts. When she looked up from the code, eyes smudged and bright, the difference was as visible as rain turning to weather. She taught mornings how to fall without breaking the parts that carry you, how to breathe as if you intend to use the air for something besides survival, how to lift a tool at the balance point so the work comes to you. He taught afternoons, the honest alphabet of fasteners, the etiquette of bearings, the way a motor thanks you when you don't make it perform while sick. The yard began to sound less like salvage and more like rehearsal. The team came on a blue noon with their paperwork ironed and their boots unscuffed. 6 silhouettes against the heat haze, and a shuttle that kept its engines alive like a threat. Their leader wore a collar that pretended to be tasteful while it advertised authority. Her badge said Retrieval Directorate, which is what you call theft after you laminate it. Project Echo assets, she announced, not quite raising her voice, are to be remanded to the custody of the licensing labs. Vorn wiped his hands on a rag that had retired from ever being clean and stepped forward with the casual competence of a man who knows where every wire runs under his feet. No Project Echo here, he said. People only. Celix moved to his left and said nothing, Tevri, which sometimes makes a better case than any argument. They tried the compliance lattice first, a soft hum in the air that turns agency into a suggestion. The new coils under the yard muttered back with a low, impolite counterfrequency, and the lattice lost the will to force. They tried a writ next, a stun stick afterward, and then the old hymn of the well-paid. We don't want trouble. Vorn smiled, the way spanners smile when someone insists a stripped bolt will tighten if you just believe. He palmed a relay on the fence, and the irrigation sprayers woke in a halo, misting the entryway with a conductive rain that made every taser in a 10-meter radius reconsider its career. A trooper lunged through anyway and found his boots kissing the unseen field. Celix stepped in, toggled the wafer Vorn had laid into her blade, and struck him twice the way a teacher knocks chalk off a ledge. No blood, just truth and gravity. If I am a weapon, she asked the leader, voice steady as a level, why is your fear so small? The leader's gaze flicked to the shuttle, to the fence line, to Vorn's hands, and back to the people behind Celix who were not kneeling and not armed and not leaving. The calculus shifted. She tried a lie that had worked everywhere else. We're here to protect you. Vorn gestured at the settlement roofs that had stopped leaking yesterday, and at the pump that no longer coughed grit into babies. The lie died with a quiet, choking sound and went to lie down somewhere out of the sun. 2 troopers holstered in the universal language of no fight pay left, and the rest did the second bravest thing they would do that day. They listened while Celix explained what it costs to wake up every morning and decide your old name is not invited. When they finally backed toward the shuttle, they took the writ with them, but left the badge. It looked wrong on the ground and right in the junk bin. That evening, Vorn found Celix on the loader's hood, watching the settlement lights blink on like cautious stars. She had his driver in her lap and the defective panel he carried in his pocket propped against her knee. They'll come back with a bigger script, she said. Then we'll write larger margins, he answered, settling beside her with the grunt of a man agreeing to grow. She told him she had added a line to her firmware that morning, a single rule a lab would have called corruptive. You may choose. I can confirm the patch took, Vorn said, because his jokes sound like maintenance when he loves you. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the yard humming below like an engine that knows where it's going. And for a long minute the future felt less like a cliff and more like a road they were going to pave themselves with stubbornness and bolts. A week later the sanctuary had a line, not of supplicants, but of neighbors carrying things that had been living in their attics. A cot, a kettle, a bag of bolts, a story. Vorn hung a new sign over the gate with a welder's ceremonial precision. Callan Yard, Repairs and Refuge. The last letter stuttered, then lit, as if the grid wanted to congratulate them and was embarrassed by the impulse. Celix caught him looking at the sign and, in a gesture that would have been impossible a month ago, crooked a finger at him and tugged him into a dance neither of them knew. 2 steps to the left, 1 to the right, laughter louder than the lamp's indignation. A clone no more. the old foreman declared from the fence, misquoting something he'd heard and making it better by accident. A wife with a workshop, Vorn corrected, pleased at the truth in the error. And the yard, which had seen empires throw away their mistakes, decided to keep this one. The first winter after the sign went up, a rumor took the long way round the belt and came home with teeth. The labs were laundering their shame into policy, publishing a humane sunset for defective lines and a bounty for anyone who made the paperwork inconvenient. Vorn read the bulletin in the soft light of the lantern. Celix had insisted they keep, even after he fixed the power, then looked at the faces sleeping under his roof and felt something old and useful click into place. "All right," he said to the room, to the rain, to the wires he'd hidden under the path. "We'll build louder." He spent a week on his back under a derelict cargo ring, teaching its ribs to remember orbit and its joints to forgive each other. He spent nights on the transmitter, braiding a dozen poor signals into one good one and anchoring it to a promise. Celix spent days on the ground, at the pump, in the alley where the kids ran drills, in the dry shed teaching the newest arrivals how to remove a brand without trading it for a scar, and evenings on the air, telling the belt, in a voice that refused to climb or apologize, what a person looks like when you stop using serial numbers as verbs. The labs answered with an indictment of legend. Vorn Kalin, accessory to property theft and conspiracy to harbor experimental weaponry. He printed it on scrap and tacked it to the war engine they'd married under, where the mist softened the paper and the metal declined to be impressed. Then he rolled a second table into the yard and labeled it registry. And when the first woman who had been called a unit stepped forward, he asked for her name and wrote it down like a repair ticket. The list grew, messy, stubborn, honest, names spelled the way their owners liked them. A column on the right for work wanted, a column on the left for skills offered, and a greasy thumbprint when fear made ink a bridge too far. "You're making a government," the parts counter matron told him, half scandal and half pride. "No," he said, checking a hinge, "I'm making maintenance." The big test arrived on a day that began with a child laughing at nothing and a sky pretending to be innocent. A lab convoy, armored and impatient, took the ridge road with their sirens held like fangs. They didn't broadcast orders, they broadcast inevitability. Vorn heard them before he saw them, a tremor through the fence posts and a chattering in the bolts, and he felt the yard lean toward him to ask, as always, what now? He answered with what he had: wires, water, will. The irrigation mains coughed awake. The copper web under the entryway learned the posture of a lake. And the old crane, rehabilitated out of spite, crouched like a friendly animal waiting to be useful. Celix gathered the sanctuary at the gate, not as a human shield but as a lesson in ratios. More lives here than you have paperwork for. More witnesses than you have rooms to threaten. The convoy stopped because the earth told it to. The lead driver saw the mist and recognized, as professionals do, the difference between weather and design. He stepped out with his hands visible and the look of a man who would rather carry good instructions than bad pride. The officer behind him was made of orders and expensive materials and tried to speak in paragraphs. Celix let her finish, then spoke 6 words that rewrote the conversation's math. "We do not return living things." Vorn hit the pump. Conductive rain reached for the stunners and took away their appetite for work. The crane swung its shadow with the solemn humor of old iron. Between one breath and the next, inevitability remembered it was only a policy. They didn't win with force, they won with stubborn infrastructure and public truth. The convoy's onboard cameras, eager and dishonest, captured a community choosing not to break. Vorn piped that footage into the belt's gossip. The miners' lunchrooms, the lonely screens above dock bunks where weary men teach themselves to sleep. When the officer ordered a charge, half her troopers looked at the puddles, the wires, the crane, and the faces, and chose a better use of the day. One of them, a young man with the lab's cereal stamped on his tongue and regret stamped nowhere yet, walked forward, removed his badge, and set it gently on the defective panel that Vorn had burnished smooth. "My sister," he said, and it was both explanation and oath, and the officer, who was not a fool, saw the math change and wrote retreat into her jaw. Retreat is not surrender. It is the shape decency uses to make space. The convoy left without dignity, but with all their tires, which is what generosity looks like in places that remember famine. The yard did not cheer because joy here is quieter than survival. Silix let out a breath she'd been holding since before she had a name and sat on the loader's step. Vorn handed her water and sat on the dirt facing her, knees bumping. Two people letting their hearts learn the new cadence they had earned. "You made a country," she said finally, staring past him at the ridiculous sign that still blinked the last letter late. "I made a shop," he corrected. "You made it a home." She reached for him with the confidence of someone whose body only carries promises now, and the ground, satisfied, stopped quivering. Spring found them busy. The sanctuary turned a derelict cargo ring into a slow, ugly station that could drift where the laws were kind and park where the work was honest. Vorn taught it to keep lights on with less apology and air clean with fewer prayers. They built a little shuttle that knew every freckle of the belt and painted its name on with a brush too wide and hope too large. Choice. Silix led the first run, ferrying 3 frightened, furious people out of a port where the labs still bought oaths by the dozen. When she stepped back onto the yard at midnight with her passengers asleep and safe, Vorn held her at the top of the ramp, like a man thanking every bolt that had decided to stay. In the morning, they held an unbranding, heated a thin iron in the forge, and, with her permission, drew it across the word on her forearm, just enough to blur the edges and leave a new texture the fingers preferred. Not erasure, not denial, just context. The scar stopped being a sentence and became a footnote she authored. The legend people told about them later sounded tidier than the days felt, but its spine was true. A human who fixed what empires broke, a woman once called a defect who refused to be anyone's project, a yard that learned to be a port, a registry that learned to be a map. Vorn never got used to being thanked and never stopped answering requests for help with a time and a list of parts. Silix never lost her soldier's edge and never again let it cut inward. At night, when the lantern's filament hummed like a warm confession, they counted the names on the board and argued about where to put the next cot. Sometimes she fell asleep soft against him, breath measured, arm across his chest, the driver he'd carved for her, hooked on a nail within reach. Sometimes he went out under the sign and listened to the station's slow turn overhead, the sound of their stubbornness learning to orbit. On the night that ended the first year, the grid held steady, the pump purred like a well-fed animal, and a wind from the east brought the smell of rain that knew its place. Vorn set the defective panel, polished smooth and gold with handling, into the cornerstone of the new workshop, letters buried, metal facing a sun it would not see for hours. Silix slid her fingers through his and tugged him down the path toward the shuttle where a new passenger waited, a woman who had cut her cereal out of her own tongue and come anyway. "Ready?" Silix asked, eyes bright with the kind of fire that warms instead of burns. "Always," he said, reaching up to tap the word painted crooked on the hull. The yard lights leaned in. The station's beacon answered. The shuttle's engine gathered itself without complaint, and together they lifted into a sky that had once agreed with their enemies and now, finally, agreed with them.